Welcome, everyone, and thank you for joining us for the Elders Climate Action August National Call. I'm Frances Stewart. I'm a volunteer with Elders Climate Action and chair of the Education Committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to moderate tonight's call with our renowned guest, Dr. Danny Richter, who I will introduce in just a moment. For those of you who are new to Elders Climate Action or who may not have heard about us, we always like to say that we are great uncles and great aunts, grandparents, and everyday folks who are determined to do all we can to leave a livable planet for future generations and all life. Our programs, communications, and chapters are focused on engaging elders in building the personal and political will needed to respond to the climate crisis. At ECA, we are elder-centered and volunteer-driven, seeking to inform, inspire, engage, and encourage older generations to take action on the climate crisis at the local, state, and national levels. Today's topic is carbon pricing and why it matters for the climate. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, calls climate pricing a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies, and 29% of global greenhouse gas emissions are already covered by such a policy. The countries implementing such a policy include every developed economy in the world except the US, as well as many emerging economies, including China, India, Brazil, Turkey, and Indonesia. Increasingly, these policies are extending accountability for emissions across borders by implementing carbon border adjustment mechanisms. 14 states that are home to over 33% of the US population and account for more than 39% of the US gross domestic product have active carbon pricing programs and are successfully reducing emissions. This talk will provide an overview of these policies, including how they work to reduce emissions, current policy trends, and where traction points for the policy might exist at the state and federal level in the U.S. Our expert speaker tonight, Dr. Danny Richter, is a policy professional with a background in the sciences. He earned his PhD in oceanography from the Scripps Institution of Oceanography at UCSD, studying paleoproxy development using diatoms and trace metals. He then went on to work for Citizens Climate Lobby, where as VP of Government Affairs, he helped pass 5 climate bills signed into law by Presidents Trump and Biden. After 9 years at CCL, he joined the Pricing Carbon Initiative, which he co-directed with the founder. Now adopted by Resources for the Future and renamed the Carbon Pricing Dialogues, Richter engages a network of over 300 stakeholders on topics inspired by, but not limited to, carbon pricing. This diverse network of policymakers, business leaders, advocates, and experts spans the political divide and addresses policy issues at the state, federal, and international levels. Danny is also the principal at Richter Capitol Hill Strategies, where he translates between science and policy to achieve data-driven outcomes. After Danny's presentation, we'll take questions and then have an action party with Climate Action Now. Please leave yourself on mute during Danny's presentation. So Danny, please take us off with your insights and updates on carbon pricing.
All right, thank you very much, Frances, and it's a pleasure to be back with the Elders Climate Action Network. I've given a couple of presentations for this group in the past, always enjoyed them, and so I'm looking forward to the discussion afterwards. But with that, let's dive in, and I think that you were able to see a black bar before, and hopefully now you can't see the black bar at the top and you should be able to see my whole slides. So this is really going to be an introduction to carbon pricing. I hope that at the end of the talk you'll know what a carbon price is and why they work. I hope you'll have a sense for carbon pricing policies in effect, both in the US and around the world, and be up to speed on current opportunities and challenges for this policy in the US. I think it'll be fun. This is the outline I'm going to follow today. First, we'll have that introduction to carbon prices, then we'll go around the world, take a tour, look at carbon pricing in other countries. We'll focus in on the United States, consider some opportunities to engage, and then we'll finish up with plenty of time for Q&A. So let's start with that introduction. The main idea between the logic for a carbon price is to make polluters pay. Polluters should not be able to dump into the atmosphere for free because everyone suffers, and to use economists speak, everyone bears a cost from that dumping. When paying something for this pollution, it makes clean fuels a better deal. And when cleaner fuels cost less, people use them more. And even the goods that are produced with clean fuels also cost less. This is the fundamental logic for a carbon price. And to illustrate this with a graph, I'm going to show this. This is from Lazards. They produce the levelized cost of energy every year. They've been doing it since 2007. And what you see here, this upper section, this is renewable generation. This gray section, this is conventional generation. And then you have inflation adjusted, levelized cost of electricity, LCOE. I don't know why those are the only ones that geothermal and coal are inflation adjusted, but that's how they have this labeled. The darker blue is the levelized cost of electricity. The lighter blue is the levelized cost of electricity with a carbon price. So Lazards did me a favor and they had a graph that had all the information that I wanted. And for these renewable sources, they're not affected by a carbon price because they're not burning carbon. I'm going to zoom in on the conventional generation, and I've added these red arrows as well as the title at the top. What they did here is they considered a $20 to $60 per ton of carbon price, and how that affects the levelized cost of electricity, which is on the x-axis. It's in dollars per megawatt hour. And what you see is here's gas peaking in the darker blue. Here's gas peaking with a carbon price, and it just shifts it to the right. There's a bigger shift for these fossil fuels on the high end, and a smaller shift on the low end. But the bottom line is for all of these, more of the time, you're going to get renewable energy instead of fossil energy. And I'll just flip up to the top so you can compare this again with the renewable sources. And that's really why carbon pricing works. A carbon price is a general term, so we're going to go over the taxonomy here, and it includes both a carbon tax and cap and trade. A carbon tax is just a straight tax on fossil fuels. You pay more for every ton or every gallon, whatever you burn. You get a predictable price with a carbon tax. You know exactly what it's going to be any given year. It has more predictable revenues as a result. It's also very simple. It's easy to impose this and collect. Governments are very good at imposing and collecting taxes. They figured that out. And you have uncertain but immediate reductions in emissions. Cap and trade, by contrast, this is also known as an emissions trading system, or ETS. Increasingly, it's called cap and invest. They're all the same thing. They're just different terms for the same thing. Instead of having price certainty with cap and trade, you have emissions certainty. And so it limits or caps the emissions. This means there's an uncertain price because the trading, the demand sets the price. Accordingly, you have uncertain revenues. The system is obviously more complex, but it is doable. Lots of places are doing it. And there's usually a delay in reducing emissions and co-pollutants because you have to set up that market, that mechanism to price it. But these are the extremes. There are a lot of policies in between. For example, you can make cap and trade more like a carbon tax by setting a price floor, where you say whatever the trading is, a permit is not going to go below this price. That's a price floor. You can also set a price ceiling. You're not going to pay more than this. And you make a carbon tax more like a cap by adding an automatic accelerator. So you say if emissions are not below this level in 2030, then the carbon price is going to go up by an additional $10 per ton or whatever you want. So there are a lot of policies in between these two extremes. One of the things I want to leave you with today is that this is an extremely flexible policy space. You can make a lot of choices that reflect your values. Because a carbon tax is simpler, I'm going to just outline the 4 key decisions you need to make to design your own policy. The first decision is what is the price and what is the rate of increase that you want. The second is what do you want to do with the revenue? Carbon prices can raise a lot of revenue, and how you use that revenue determines what populations within your jurisdiction end up ahead. You need to decide if you're going to do a border carbon adjustment, and if you decide yes, how you're going to structure that. And the fourth decision is, are you going to simplify some regulations? Every Republican who has signed onto a carbon price has demanded some sort of regulatory treatment, but the answer could be no, I don't want to do that. One thing I want to stress with the initial price and the rate of increase in any economic model you see, this alone determines the emissions reductions. And that goes back to the graph I showed you at the beginning. It's the price that shifts the decisions, making fossil fuels more expensive and the energy they produce more expensive. The price is what gets the emissions reductions. The models do not put the revenue use to things that are also going to reduce emissions. Even if you have a policy like, say, Washington State's cap and invest program, where they use some of the revenue to invest in cleaner boats, cleaner ferries, that is not modeled as reducing emissions. So it's the price alone that gets the emissions reductions. This gives policymakers a lot of flexibility in how they use the revenue to keep a maximum number of their constituents happy. The purpose of the border carbon adjustment is to prevent leakage. Leakage is where a company moves to a more permissive or lower priced regime and then just re-exports that good back to the country that they left. That's not desirable. And regulatory treatment, that can reduce some things that economists view as inefficient. It's a favorite word of economists. So like I said, this is an opportunity for you to design a policy that reflects. So what carbon pricing policy would you design? Do you prioritize emissions reductions? Well, then you want a higher price or a higher escalator. You want to take care of the poor? Then you're going to favor a dividend, also known as a lump sum rebate. You can think of it as like a reverse income tax, and it could be for income tax you didn't know. The poor tend to fare better with that because they're poor. They don't spend money. They just don't have enough money to spend, and carbon is embedded in all the things we buy. You want to grow GDP, corporate tax offset. You want to enforce global participation, think about the border adjustment. You want to streamline government, think about the reductions in other regulations. You want a roughly equal impact for everyone, payroll taxes. If you want to do a little bit of all of these, you can mix and match. You don't have to dedicate the revenue to all one thing. And this is again to emphasize there's a lot of choice. If you want to play around with this is a link to a resource going back to the 116th Congress. We're now in the 119th. This was the Congress of the carbon price. And someone I work with, Mark Halfstead, he created this calculator. There were 8 carbon pricing bills that were introduced, and he modeled them. This is showing the annual emissions reduction, but if you want to look at what the impact is, it's known as incidence on different populations, wealthy or poor, you can see that. You can see the total amount of money it raises. This is the first of a few tools I'm going to show you that you can easily access. And if you're really interested, you can play around, and that's going to help you really engage with the content in a different way, and I hope understand it better. So this is a great online calculator. Even though it's from a few Congresses ago, it's still really useful. I did want to spend a little bit more time on incidence. And so this is a paper from 2014, so going back a while, but it's a very clear primer for understanding how different uses of the revenue affect different populations. And so what you're looking at here is the lightest blue is the bottom quintile, the first quintile, the lowest income 20% of the United States. So quintile, you take 100, you divide it by 5, you get 20%, 20%, 20%. Each of those is a quintile. So you have the poorest quintile is the lightest blue, the wealthiest quintile is the darkest blue, almost black. And then this yellow kind of hashed line, that's the mean household. So that's going to reflect average GDP is really what it's doing. And so what you're looking at here, capital recycling, that's a corporate tax offset. And you'll notice this is regressive. The only quintile that benefits is the wealthiest quintile, but you also have the lowest negative impact on GDP. For labor recycling, that's a payroll tax offset. Like I said, everybody is just kind of a little bit, they're pretty much the same. And the impact on GDP, the mean household, is a little bit worse than this. And then here you notice something very, very different. The bottom three quintiles, so as many as 60% of households, they end up ahead, with the lowest income household ending up like 3.4% more than they had. This might be of interest to politicians who are concerned about, oh, I don't know, affordability. But on the other side, you look at this, and the mean household this is the most negative, but it's still not to one. And as I said, this is from 2014. This is still a great starting place to understand incidence. But since then, there's been research sometimes discovering a double dividend, where you can make some populations better off, and you actually don't have a negative hit to GDP at all. So anyway, just noting that this is from 2014. It's still a great primer, but more research has been done, and you can sometimes get a double dividend, it seems. I also want to just emphasize how much economists like this. And so a lot of these quotes are from the Waxman-Markey days. That was when the last time that carbon price was at the very center, the very focus of American politics. And so you had a lot of polling and studies at that time. This is from 2009, a survey of economists. They found that 97.9% of economists surveyed agreed or strongly agreed that placing a price on carbon through a tax or cap and trade system will increase incentives for energy efficiency and the development of lower carbon energy production. Next to it, this is from Columbia University. For decades, economists have recommended a price on carbon as an important element of a cost-effective strategy to address the risks of climate change. And what I like about this is it's such a truism. It's so textbook for the researchers at Columbia. They didn't even cite this statement. It is not even worth citing in the economic profession. Here on the left, this is from the Congressional Budget Office. I think of them as, the group of nerds who are paid by Congress to be nonpartisan. I envision them in a basement somewhere. I don't know if that's true. But in 2008, they found that a tax on emissions would be the most efficient incentive-based option for reducing emissions and could be relatively easy to implement. And this is such an overwhelming consensus that even scientists are getting in on the game. This was mentioned in the intro, but this is from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Special Report on a 1.5 degree world. And I'll remind you that these are consensus documents. Every scientist who signs their name on there and contributes agrees with the text. Explicit carbon prices remain a necessary condition of ambitious climate policies, and some authors highlighted the potential benefit brought by coordination among groups of countries. So there's a strong consensus, and we'll talk about coordination among groups of countries more later in this talk. So carbon prices work by making polluters pay for their emissions, which makes low emissions energy a better deal more of the time. Carbon prices are very flexible policies and can easily be crafted to reflect the values and priorities of those imposing them. And scientists and economists are strongly in favor. Now let's have a world tour. Let's look at what carbon prices are doing around the world. Here's a map from the World Bank. They recently updated their tool. And what you're looking at, red is a carbon tax implemented in that country. Blue is an ETS, that's an emissions trading system, or cap and trade, cap and invest. That's where one of those is implemented. Purple are those countries who found they liked carbon pricing so nice, they implemented it twice. And they have both a tax and an ETS, and the lighter shades of each of those colors are places that have one under consideration. And what the World Bank found with their 2006 report is that now 29% of global emissions are covered, 25% emissions by an ETS, 4% by a carbon tax. This amounts to 87 overall implemented, and carbon taxes now have a slight advantage over emissions trading systems, even though they're covering more emissions. This is a 10%, a number of 10 more programs since last year. So 10 more programs have been implemented in the last year alone. These programs raised $107 billion in revenue, most of that coming from ETSs, although carbon taxes are not shabby given that they only cover 4% of emissions. And the share of emissions by income group, most of this is coming from high income countries. Middle income countries have 22%. And as you'll see, that is growing. So that's just a survey in numbers of what's going on around the world. As was also mentioned, the United States is the only developed economy without a carbon price. I wrote about this in a recent blog for Resources magazine. This is Resources for the Future. This is actually a republication of a blog, and we updated it with refreshed data. But it is a reprint from when I was running the carbon pricing initiative. And this is part of a table, what you can see. And what I did in the blog was I just looked at what are the developed economies. Do they have a national carbon price? The United States is the only one that doesn't have one. That's the blog. I also went in this table and I listed what are the compliance mechanism type. Is it an ETS? When was it implemented? And do they have a carbon border policy? So do they have something to address leakage as well? For a long time, the answer was no. Actually, until this year, no country, actually I think it was last year, no country had implemented any kind of border adjustment. And now a lot of them do. So that is interesting. So the United States is an outlier, and the link here if you want to read the blog down there. To tell the story of especially carbon border adjustment mechanisms, you need to really understand the EU, what's going on there, the European Union. They have a cap and trade system. It's covering heat, electricity, maritime emissions from ships, aviation, and the industrial sector. It started in 2005, and the current price is 82 euros, so a big carbon price. It is the first program to pair with a CBAM. And I said this year because in 2006 and on January 1st, that's when companies owe money. But going back to 2023, that's when they were required to report. So for 3 years, the EU said, we want you to report the emissions for products. We know this is complicated. You don't have to pay us. And in fact, even though they're liable for imports starting in January 1st of this year, they don't have to pay anything until September of next year. I don't know how that works, but that's the way it is. They are investing more heavily in this. EU ETS 2 launches in 2027 next year, and is going to include more sectors. So they are increasing their level of ambition, which I think is remarkable. And this graph just shows how they're spending the revenue, which is always interesting. The EU CBAM is Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism. So it's this border consideration that I've been talking about. That's what the EU decided to call it. I think that's the term that's going to stick because they were the first one. As I said, reporting started in 2023. Owing for payment starts this year. It covers cement, iron and steel, aluminum, fertilizers, electricity, and hydrogen. It is linked to the EU ETS, and it was meticulously crafted to be compatible with WTO law. Very, again, in contrast to what the United States is doing right now, blowing up the rules-based order. The EU is still very much interested in this, and their carbon price and its CBAM are also very closely linked to this. And this is going to relate to some points I'll make later on. Again, in the interest of giving you tools, if you want to dig deeper, here's a cool tool that the World Bank puts on. You can take a country of interest and you can look at the different elements that are covered by the CBAM and how much they're going to be exposed now that it's in effect. So if this is something that's interesting you, you can follow this link and learn more. The CBAM has generated a lot of copycats. And so here are the flags of some countries that have started or started investigating policies of their own. And that's reflected in that table of the blog I referenced earlier. Even members of Congress in the United States have taken note and they have drafted related policy, including the Foreign Pollution Fee Act, which is a Republican-only bill. It's a tariff only, no domestic carbon price. The Clean Competition Act, that's a Democrat-only bill. It does have a domestic carbon price. The Prove It Act, which is now law, and the Prove It Act just counts atoms and assigns them to products. And this passed in a very sneaky way. It's a thrilling tale, I'll tell you sometime if you want. But that is now the law of the land. And what is very apparent if you're following these things, that the EU CBAM is the reason that you're seeing such a surge in policies that are implemented, policies that are being considered. This is a graph from a 2000 paper, also from Resources for the Future. And what they found is that when a large economy, that is the EU, prices carbon, global interest spikes. And so all you're seeing in this graph is the data points and media hits at different months, 6-month rolling average of pricing and border media hits in red, a green, a rolling monthly average of all media hits. And so you're seeing carbon pricing. And then the lines here are significant milestones in the development of the EU CBAM. And so what the authors argue is that the EU CBAM is driving interest in carbon pricing in countries that don't have it. And this is another graph that they use just showing the increase in carbon pricing or border policies under development or under consideration, in discussion, or implemented since the EU first announced their CBAM. At the COP in December of last year, there was a pretty significant development. I had mentioned that the EU was paying very close attention to WTO law in crafting their CBAM. At the COP30, it was announced that there was going to be formed an open coalition on carbon markets. And this included 18 diverse signatories from the global north and global south who account for 40% of global emissions. And I think that this is interesting because you start to see forming what could become a carbon club or a climate club. And this is just the idea that you have a club of countries that price carbon, and they basically say, if you're in the club, you don't have to pay at our borders. If you're outside of the club, you got to pay. So it's a geopolitical tool to force countries that are on the outside, like the United States, to act in a way that is different, and specifically pricing carbon. There are a lot of potential CBAMs to join this club. This is from the 2025 World Bank report. Collectively, countries with carbon pricing in force represent almost 2/3 of global GDP. And you can see this is the US dollar per price of their various carbon prices, where they have an ETS or carbon tax, and what percentage of carbon emissions in each of these jurisdictions are covered. So really a lot of detail in this report. And emerging companies are also getting into this. Very populous emerging economies. So this table lists 5 countries. These 5 countries are the most populous, the second most populous, the 4th, 7th, and 18th most populous countries in the world. In total, it includes 3.4 billion people, or 42% of the global population in these 5 countries. They also account for 43% of global emissions, and they are pricing carbon. China already has a carbon price, Indonesia already has a carbon price, Brazil, India, and Turkey have announced carbon prices and are busy implementing them. These 3 countries, India, Brazil, and Turkey, account for 12% of emissions. And I think this is significant because that's the US percent of emissions. But unlike the United States, they have 21% of the world's population. And this is just, I've just blown up in this slide and the next slide what was in that table, which might have been difficult for you to read. Anyway, the world is pricing carbon with interest and adoption rates accelerating. The US is an outlier among developed economies and increasingly compared to middle-income countries. Interest is growing in rich and very populous middle-income countries for some sort of climate club based on a carbon price. We'll come back to that again in the section after the United States. What's going on in the United States? Well, here you do have to start with the states. There are 14 states that price carbon, And what you see, here's the list. And Virginia is new as of July. They have rejoined RGGI. And so if you're looking at the map, you'll note that it is from January 2025. It is out. I've been in touch with the good folks at C2ES. They're a business focused think tank in DC. They're working on updating this, but in the meantime, I've just left it. Just please note that it is updated. Their numbers are a little bit lower. I made a good faith approximation in increasing them to include Virginia. And you have 33% of the US population who lives in a state with a carbon price. And that includes 39% of US gross domestic product. So these states are overperforming. They're usually above average in terms of their productivity. So that's interesting. You can also have carbon pricing at the city level. So New York City, it's not a carbon price because it's not on carbon, but it is on congestion. So it's on cars, which are overwhelmingly fossil fuel burning, and it puts that charge on them when they enter Manhattan. Effectively a carbon price. I like to think this is a carbon price. 1 year in, it's improved the life for New Yorkers. So here, this is from the New York Times, the local paper, and they found after 1 year that congestion pricing reduced 11% of the vehicles that once entered Manhattan's central business district. And they include quotes from residents saying it's less noisy, I'm saving so much time on my commute. It's generally improved their lives is my main takeaway from that article. I also want to put on your radar building performance standards. This is another blog I wrote, again, a reprint from my time at PCI. But building performance standards, they're standards, they're a regulation, but really they, especially in the penalty for non-compliance, they act as a carbon price. And these have really been increasing in their frequency. You're finding them in more and more places. And so if they're not on your radar and you're interested in this kind of policy, I'd put them on your radar. Buildings account for, I think it's like 40% of global emissions. And that's hidden in general statistics that are common in the United States because buildings have both electricity and they have heating, and those are usually separated out. And so, but when you combine them, you have buildings 40%. It's a big deal. So anyway, building performance standards is another thing that is increasing in the United States. But at the federal level, I'm not optimistic. You can argue for a carbon price, and the argument for a carbon price in the United States at the federal level would be this CBO, Congressional Budget Office list of big revenue raisers. And you see at the bottom, impose a tax on greenhouse gas emissions. I think that they consider a $25 carbon price, and it could raise between $571 and $865 billion over 10 years. And the GOP just blew up the debt with the One Big Beautiful Bill Act. They cut taxes and increased spending. So maybe Congress will look for revenue raisers. The arguments against this are that same GOP removed a methane fee, which was included in the Inflation Reduction Act, and that was going to raise some money, but they got rid of it. One of the first instances of Republicans bucking President Trump happened last year when he suggested new taxes, and Republican leadership said, nope, we're not going to do that. And there's just no doubt in my mind that they would consider this a tax and anathema. And just generally Trump's positioning, all of this leads me to think that a carbon price in the United States at the federal level is not imminent. So what are the opportunities to engage? And here, this is going to be pretty speculative. And so I've given you a list of carbon prices. The way I'm going to frame this is what existing trends, if any, could force a reckoning for the US policymakers on a carbon price. Because I've just said, we're focusing on the federal level. I'm pessimistic for the reasons I laid out. I think it's going to require a pretty big shock to the system. I think you're really going to have to shake things up. And I see two things that are possible that could do this, of a magnitude high enough to do this. One would be fiscal considerations, and the other would be geopolitical pressure. So let's look at the fiscal considerations here. The thing that I'm looking at is I think that the lesson the Republican Party learned from George H.W. Bush's defeat in 1992 was never vote for a tax increase, ever. And I just read an account that documented the last Republican to vote for a tax increase in the United States was Senator Pete Domenici from New Mexico, and that was 36 years ago. Democrats, I don't think, figured this out until 2010. And now you have what I call American-style budgeting, which is just cutting taxes and increasing spending. This is another blog I wrote. It's not online at the moment, although I'm working on getting it back up. And the question is, why can we get away with this? Why can the United States get away with American-style budgeting, whereas another country, they don't do this? I think it might be the dollar is the reserve currency and the resulting low interest you get. I also think that this might be why we're the only developed economy without a carbon price. And like I said, this is very speculative. And the argument for why other countries can't get away with this is Liz Truss. And so Liz Truss was the shortest lived prime minister of Great Britain. She lasted only 6 weeks. And this is a photo from the Daily Star. They bought a head of lettuce and they said, we think that Liz Truss's premiership will not outlast this head of lettuce. And they were right. This is a picture of the head of lettuce celebrating that it has lasted longer than Liz Truss. And what Liz Truss did is she did American style budgeting. She proposed a mini budget that would decrease taxes and increase spending. And she was out of government within 6 weeks. Why doesn't that happen in the United States? And just in terms of this, so that's reserve currency. This is just the fiscal standpoint right now. The debt, this has been in the news this week, just hit $40 trillion. That's a doubling since 2000. The deficit, that is the difference between how much money we're going to raise and how much money we're going to spend in a year, is $1.8 trillion. Interest alone on servicing the debt, the total amount we owe was $1 trillion last year. That's larger than any single line item, larger than defense, larger than Social Security, just on paying the deficit. And this is, to give you an illustration of how long this is, I checked today, but this is their graph that they have on the Treasury site. It was last updated September 30th, 2025, so 11 months ago. And the debt then was 37.6 trillion. They don't have something more accurate that reflects the 40 trillion number. So this may signal that this pain is coming, because you have 5 options to address the debt. You can either cut spending. Republicans really enjoy doing that. You can have extraordinary economic growth. Everybody loves doing that, but it's hard to manufacture. You can increase taxes, and that's the nub, the focus here. You can default on your debt. President Trump has floated that at various times. You can also inflate it away if your GDP is growing faster than inflation. But at the same time, you have debt crises around the world at a time where the threat of war is growing. You also have an affordability crisis. And just these numbers, the reason why I have this, I pulled these from this article from The Economist. I'm, again, an oceanographer, not an economist. Other reasons to think there might be pain coming in the United States, again, the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, or BBBA, extended Trump's tax cuts, increased spending. You see all these examples of other countries divesting from institutions of American soft power. You're seeing a movement away from the dollar. You're seeing a movement away from reliance on NATO in Europe. You're seeing countries who remain interested in the WTO and the framework of that, the USMCA, but trying to de-risk from US dependence. And in general, you see the US more isolated while also ceding geopolitical advantage on scientific research and climate, mostly to China. And the argument for this second thing, the geopolitical shock, is the US is alone. It would be very easy for every other developed economy to form a climate club. It wouldn't be very easy, but it's very, you can think about it and it's not too hard to imagine. And we'd be isolated. So Does cooperation on carbon pricing for all the countries that have some sort of carbon price, does this become a way for them to exert enough pressure on the United States that it creates a crisis and we're forced to consider a carbon price at the federal level? Maybe. Some factors that might weigh into that. The US is the world's largest producer of both oil and natural gas, so other countries will view it as the point of leverage. The US in the past year has thrown out the rules of global trade that it wrote over decades, kidnapped a sitting head of state in his own country, citing oil reserves as a justification, and started a war with Iran that choked off 20% of global oil flows. All that is just to say we've pissed a lot of people off. The US has withdrawn from the Paris Agreement and myriad other international fora. Other countries are scrambling to form trade partnerships that do not involve the US. We escalated a trade war. The headlines today were that with Canada, one of our biggest three trading partners, have increased. They've levied 50% tariffs on us, and other countries remain committed to a clean transition. These are all the factors that I see that might play into this becoming a pain point that forces consideration. So maybe you found this convincing, maybe you didn't. Maybe you disagree with the premise, and maybe you think that there doesn't need to be a shock for the United States to consider a carbon price at the federal level. But this is where I'm at, and I look forward to discussing it. So to conclude, carbon pricing is a useful tool beloved by economists and scientists. It makes polluters pay, thus changing the value proposition between polluting and non-polluting energy sources. The US is the only developed economy without a national carbon price. 14 US states with about 39% of US GDP and only 33% of the US population already have carbon prices. Fiscal considerations and geopolitical pressure may or may not finally force the US to join the rest of the developed world in adopting a carbon price. But until then, state and local opportunities for engagement exist around sectoral policies that are effective carbon prices like building performance standards and congestion pricing, or of course your state carbon price. And that's it. So I'll stop sharing and look forward to your questions.
Thanks, Danny. That was a lot of really useful and interesting information and a great perspective. We have a lot of things to think about and probably a lot of questions to ask. So please, for our audience, don't go anywhere. We'll be doing questions and answers. And then after that, we'll start our action party. So you're welcome to put your questions in the chat and we'll ask them for you, or you can raise your hand and ask your questions yourself. And I think we have some questions already in the chat. One question was, for a carbon price to work, it has to be high enough. And usually that means it's going to start at a level and be escalated, whether it's the tax on carbon or the cap getting smaller and smaller. Who does that? And how do we ensure that it's actually effective?
I would quibble. I don't think it needs to be that high to be effective. I think that you can get emissions reductions with even a relatively small carbon price. You can't get enough emissions reductions to solve the problem, but you can still get emissions reductions, and that's effective. And in terms of how people are, it's economists who are watching this and who are looking at the data and who have a lot of examples now around the world over decades that they've been able to draw on, and they've all pretty much reinforced their textbook prior that also based on evidence that carbon prices work. One of the quotes that I loved from this year's 2026 State and Trends of Carbon Pricing from the World Bank is they highlight, we expect to see more emissions, I'm going to paraphrase, more emissions under a carbon price in the coming years, but a problem they have is that they're so effective that when they go into place in a country, the emissions assigned to that country go down. And so it's an actually decreasing share of emissions that are subject to a carbon price because they work. And so I thought that was a funny problem as they're trying to make this case. Look at all these emissions that are covered by a carbon price. The percent keeps going down because it just works so well.
Sounds like a great problem to have. Someone asked in the chat, how much money has the state of Washington raised with its program?
I'm afraid I don't have those numbers at the top of my mind. We're both going to have to chase those down.
That's totally understandable. Another question is about the impact of the 2028 election. That's possible that we'll have an election outcome that will have a materially positive impact um, in many ways and could have a big impact on the possibility of getting a nationwide carbon price. And what do you think about that?
I also think you need to convince Democrats of this.
Mhm.
Uh, and I think that I forget his name. He was Biden's climate czar, but he does not want a carbon price. He thinks it's a bad idea. And so I don't think you're going to see and he's very influential within the Democratic establishment, obviously. I don't think you're going to get a Democrat only carbon price. I think the only way to get a carbon price at the federal level is if it's bipartisan. And as I laid out, I think that would require Republicans breaking their 35-year streak of not voting for a tax increase. And to me, even with 2028, I think it's going to take something big. Maybe you can get the methane emissions reduction program, the methane fee back. Maybe you can get sectoral carbon prices back in some way, shape, or form. But again, I think it's a really significant barrier that no Republican has voted for a carbon price since 1990.
What do you see
Or
as the potential?
I said carbon price, any tax increase. Sorry, it's
Mhm.
more general.
Yeah. What do you see as the potential in the states?
Um, a lot of states just doubled down on their
Mhm.
carbon price. So Reggie passed their third review period, and Reggie is interesting because they're really emphasizing that this is affordability policy.
Mhm.
They raised so much money. We're dealing with a affordability prices crisis. Let's make affordability better with this revenue from polluters. California uh, doubled down on their cap and trade. They rebranded it Cap and Invest, and they're figuring out the logistics there. The voters in Washington State in 2024 voted with a ballot initiative to keep their Cap and Invest program. So I think that states that have it are doubling down. I think we'll see about other states. I haven't seen much impetus for expanding that map, but I would be happy to be surprised in that direction.
Yeah. I live in Maryland. I'm a big Reggie fan. As we see really some significant affordability advantages, public health advantages, and other things. Also seeing attacks on Reggie. How would you suggest that we defend what we have
Sorry, I missed a word. A tax on what?
on Reggie? Basically, the idea, even though if you look at the data, clearly Reggie's improved affordability. That's not what we hear from certain people, mostly Republican legislators.
Yeah, states do have to balance their budget year in year, and there are really very few instances globally of countries that have passed a carbon price and then gotten rid of it.
Mhm.
So I think that there is, and I think it's just because it produces so much money. If you're
Yeah.
not America, if you don't have the dollar as the world's reserve currency, you have to balance your budgets have to make more sense. And so I think that those states that have it, I think that they will continue to have it because they solve a lot of problems that politicians commonly have. I think it would be great for people who happen to live in a state that have a carbon price to be vocal about, no, I'm really glad we have this. Here are the benefits that I see, whatever those are. Here's how it makes my life more affordable. Here's what I've been able to use. Here's how I would prefer to live in a state that has it versus one that doesn't. So I think that talking about it more is really, really important. But I also think that I think those programs are going to continue, and the fiscal constraints are, I think, the most likely avenue for pushing into new states because it's a lot of potential revenue that again can solve a lot of problems that politicians commonly have.
How do you think the Make Polluters Pay campaign is going to affect working for carbon pricing?
I think that making polluters pay is. Are you talking specifically about the past emissions?
Yes. the carbon, sort of the climate superfund ideas.
Yeah. Uh, I don't know. I think that those are kind of separate. So the just for those who may not have heard about it, the carbon super fund is saying, all right, companies, fossil fuel companies, here's the emissions that you're accountable for in our state. This is causing harm. We're going to legislate that you need to make a one-time payment for those past emissions to make up for those harms in some way. I think that the elements that there's very clearly an element that is like a carbon price. The element that is not like a carbon price is a one-time thing looking backwards. I think it can get some voters used to the idea of making polluters pay, and maybe some of them make the leap. But I don't expect the opposition to go down very much. I do think you've seen a lot of opposition to that, and I don't know that the enthusiasm that I've seen has not been quite enough to convince me that it's going to make the leap to, okay, now we also want you to pay for emissions today and moving forward. So we'll see. There's potential, but I'm not super convinced that it's going to be a watershed.
What do you think are our most effective advocacy opportunities to work for a carbon price in the coming years?
I think that I think education is really important. Learning about this policy and all of the places that it's happening. For a long time, there was this possibility that the United States could lead, and with the rest of the world pricing carbon, that ship has sailed. But I think that Americans still feel like we should be leading, and so I think there's an element of FOMO, generating FOMO, fear of missing out, highlighting what other countries are doing, and that it could be this tool of geopolitical coercion. I think I think that people pay attention to that. It shifts their existing view of the world and themselves that may open opportunities for action. I think that those sectoral carbon prices, the building performance standards, congestion charges, another one, it made it into a Biden budget, and Markey he called it the Fat Cat tax, and it was a tax only on private jet fuel because they don't pay a tax for the bigger airports, and so just make it even. So anyway, I think that slicing and dicing the place where we see emissions, I think it doesn't register the same level of opposition. And so the sectoral carbon prices, the local carbon prices, and the state level carbon prices, and talking to education, talking to friends and family, and learning about what the rest of the world is doing in particular.
Some of the climate advocates I work with have the idea that carbon pricing just lets corporations pay to pollute. What would you say to those folks?
I think that the answer is what I spoke about earlier with it's too effective to the numbers keep going down. So I think that if it was, or just show them the Lazard's graph that I started this presentation. I think that business folks will recognize that, oh, this is a dollars and cents case, and what you're talking about is auctions that the regional power grids are going to offer, and the more often renewables are going to have a lower price, they're going to be able to offer a lower price, and they're going to outbid fossil fuels. And so, I mean, just you add that up over time, and you're going to have a lot fewer emissions reductions. And so, I do think that there is an element of I'm a geologist by training, just geologic forces, time and pressure, just really cooking something and turning it into something else. And I think that's where a carbon price has been really effective.
Mhm. What role do you think energy efficiency plays in all this?
Huge. Carbon price is best thought of as a complement to other policies. It makes everything else you might try more effective. Of course, if you're doing these things, the signal of the carbon price will be lower, but your overall emissions are also going to be lower, and that's the goal. So carbon price makes every other policy that wants to reduce emissions more effective.
So I think some of our members are probably not familiar with building energy performance standards. Could you tell us a little bit about how that works?
Most people are not. They're pretty under the radar. And so when that the first time I wrote that blog, there were only 14 cities and states that had them, and now I know there are more. But basically, you say, all right, here's a bunch of buildings in a city, or you can do it at a campus. So I know that MIT and Harvard or Cambridge, Massachusetts, they shared that, and it's for the campuses. And you say you can have certain emissions per square foot for these buildings, and you can reduce it as a whole. But by setting up that framework, it forces the owners of a lot of buildings to say, all right, let's think about updates to these buildings in the context of the carbon emissions. And they weren't doing that before.
Mhm.
And so when you bring those future emissions, you're bringing into the present day decision making with the building performance standard. That to me is what a carbon price is. It brings climate futures into present day decision making. And building performance standards do that by, all right, the penalties for these things are huge. They're like $250 per ton. So huge penalties if if you're not meeting the standard. And so there's a pretty strong incentive. Okay, let's update the HVAC. Okay, let's move our boiler and let's go with a heat pump. And over the course of this whole portfolio of buildings, and I mean that's how they work, is by making it very clear, assigning a dollar amount to decisions that have long time horizons. Again, the geology analogy works here too.
Sure, we could ask questions probably all night, but we're starting to run low on time, and I think we've got lots to think about. Um, you know, Danny's done a great job of explaining the different ways our carbon price might work and how um, it can work with other policies and how we can adjust our policies based on what we value and what we're trying to accomplish, and that this really is not a strange idea. This is happening all over the world and in many U.S. states, and can be an outstanding tool in our toolbox to move us where we need to go. So, thank you so much. We are really appreciate you being here, and you've given us a lot to think about. People will have the recording and the slides because there's a lot to absorb. Um, so thank you again. And for everyone who can, please stay for our action party where you can do some things about making a carbon price more of a reality here in the United States.
Thank you, everyone, for being here tonight. Thank you so much, Danny, for joining us, and Francis for hosting tonight's call. If you don't know me, I'm Jen Chandler, and I have the honor of being Director of Elders Climate Action. Before we start tonight's action party, I'd like to take a moment to just acknowledge the passing of Dolly Parton and honor her for the beauty that she contributed to our world. Not only was she an incredibly talented musician known as the Queen of Country Music, but she was an environmentalist and a human rights advocate who dedicated her life to improving the lives of others. A dedicated philanthropist and powerfully outspoken voice for protecting our planet and its people. She was a legend, an icon, and a hero, and she will be missed. So thank you, Dolly. Now, let's get started with tonight's action party and help protect our planet by pushing decision makers towards climate solutions. Due to a few changes in our scheduling with our partners at Climate Action Now, we will be now hosting our own action parties. So let me go ahead and bring up our action tracker and we'll get tonight's action party started. And it looks like there are a few folks who have already been in there taking action. So we're always excited to see. So let me just do a couple of little things here and I will get us. All right. So everybody should be able to see the goal tracker. Mark, can you give me a thumbs up if you see it?
Yep, I see it, Jen.
Perfect. Thank you. And so to get us started, we have this QR code over here on the right-hand side of the screen. You can aim your phone at it, and there should be a little link that pops up, and you can click on that little link, and that will take you into our website and into tonight's action carousel. Our partners at Climate Action Campaign have curated a list of actions for tonight. Many of them are related to tonight's call and the theme of tonight's call, carbon pricing, and we'll make it really quick and easy for you to be able to connect and take action. If you don't know how to use a QR code or you don't want to use the QR code, feel free to use that little bit.ly short link there at the bottom of your screen as another way that you can connect into this carousel tonight. And Paloma can drop that bit.ly link in the chat box for you so you can easily click and connect onto it. Um, I had a quick minute to just take a quick look through our action carousel tonight, and it looked like Climate Action Now curated some really good actions for us to take. It's always important for us to be sending these messages, signing these petitions, sending these emails or these sign-on letters, or sometimes it's asking us to connect and make a phone call to our members of Congress or to state legislators or other decision makers and lawmakers. Um, and every time that we contact them, we are showing that climate action matters. We're showing them that their voters, their constituents are concerned about climate change and that they want to see action. And that's the only way they know that we want them to do something is by us showing up and letting them know and telling them and keeping that message really consistent and really loud and really in their ear. So, this isn't something that we just do once and walk away, but this is sustained action. We're building muscle memory here. We are becoming advocates for change every single month. We take action together. We spend 15 minutes and we really dive in and make our voices heard to the decision makers out there. Has anybody found any interesting actions as they've been going through the deck tonight that they want to talk about? Or Mark, have you taken any actions this evening?
What? I'm getting I have to get a security code for some reason. I just had my computer into the shop because of viruses, and so I have a lot of new stuff. But anyway, the other good thing is feedback. You will you will get I don't think it's just me. The next day you'll get emails from all the places you sent messages to that confirm that your message went through to them that you take tonight. So it's just another good way to know that it got through to somebody and you just know it worked.
Agreed. And sometimes you get responses. We get responses back from members of Congress regularly addressing some of the issues that we write to them about. And so it's always nice to be able to get to have that interaction with members of Congress and sort of build that relationship with them. Anybody else out there tonight have any actions that they just took that they really appreciate?